Good evening, and thank you everyone for joining us for what I know is going to be a thought-provoking and stimulating and engaging and delightful evening. But first, I would like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, who are the traditional custodians of the Canberra area, and pay respects to the elders past and present of all Australia's Indigenous peoples. My name is Sarah James. I'm an author, I'm a journalist, and just in case my accent has not betrayed me, I am not originally from Australia, but I am a happy and proud immigrant to Australia. I've had the honor of living here now for 7 years, and this is my home. I am delighted to be your facilitator for this evening, and having already spoken to some of you, not all of you yet, I know that it's going to be engaging, and I know you all have so much to say that I'm going to have to do my level best to rein everybody in and bring everybody out at the same time. I won't even give you a hard time about that. I'm just glad it happened to you first. No worries at all. We have a very distinguished group of guests tonight, and I would like to welcome some of them who are here, some who will be here shortly, and I'll say all the welcomes now. The Honourable Paul Fletcher, MP, Parliamentary Secretary to the Communications Minister. The Honourable Chris Bowen, MP, Shadow Treasurer, who we anticipate will be here shortly. And we also shortly anticipate the Honourable Andrew Leigh, MP, Shadow Assistant Treasurer. I do see Senator Nick Xenophon. And our host for this evening, who you may already have had the opportunity to meet, Australian Unity Chairman Glenn Barnes and Group Managing Director Rowan Mead, who you just heard from a moment ago. So welcome, gentlemen, welcome all of you to this evening. Celebrated historian David McCullough once said, "No harm is done to history by making it something someone would want to read." And I think that's aptly put, because I think the book that you're going to have an opportunity to get there at your place tonight is something well worth reading. I've read it a couple of times now. It's engaging, it's smart, it's thought-provoking. It's both a lesson in history, and it also offers observations and ideas for the future. And as Rowan said, and I'll give him an opportunity in just a moment to speak more, but that's why we've divided this evening into two parts. The first part is our book launch, and that's exciting. We want to talk about this book and all that is in it. But we also want all of you to help us engage with the issues and the themes and the thoughts that are in this book and tease out what that means for our future. As the multi-talented writer G.K. Chesterton once observed, history is a hill or a high point of vantage from which alone we see the age in which we are living. And that is exactly what we want to have happen tonight. We want to use this information from the past to talk to us about where we are right now and where we're going. We hope to rise up to a point on that hill, look at the lie of the land, and see the pathways that lead us forward. But first, may I now ask you to join me in welcoming Australian Unity Group Managing Director Rowan Mead to the podium to officially launch our evening.
Thank you, Sarah, and good evening and welcome. Welcome again to all panellists and guests, and I'd like to reiterate the acknowledgement of the traditional owners of this land and the custodians of the grounds on which we stand. I'd also like to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are actually with us this evening. 2015 marks Australian Unity's 175th anniversary, making it one of Australia's oldest continuing companies and organisations. And to mark this milestone, we commissioned a book. But we weren't after a stock standard corporate history. Rather, we were interested in the role of the so-called friendly societies, of which our antecedent organisations number, and what role those particular organisations played in Australian history and what relevance, if any, they may hold today and, more importantly, tomorrow. So we commissioned historian Alex McDermott to explore this little understood chapter of Australian history. It's a shame he can't be here tonight due to illness. But what Alex has produced in this book, of no personal influence, which is on the table in front of us, and how people of common enterprise unexpectedly shaped Australia, is something I think of a remarkable insight. It prompted us to do something more than simply launch it. We wanted to get some of the nation's leading minds to explore the themes that were uncovered within the book and within this particular aspect of Australia's history and life, and explore the relevance of those aspects to our future considerations. We do this as an organisation which has an abiding interest in contributing to the public discourse in Australia generally, but also across specific policy areas, and we're acutely concerned in matters to do with social infrastructure spanning health, aged care and other areas of service delivery of a community service nature. So here we are tonight doing just that. And might I take a moment to offer our particular thanks to Paul Fletcher for his and his team, particularly Cathy Welsh and Sam Bradshaw, for all their assistance in putting this forum together, including organising this committee room at Parliament. Thank you, Paul. Let me clarify for those in the room this perhaps unfamiliar term, friendly society. Friendly societies, very briefly, were associations drawn together for a common purpose, often that purpose being to pool funds through regular donations in order that life's exigencies and vicissitudes could be dealt with. In other words, they were early financial services organisations, in part. They were also precursors to formal political parties and other political organisations in Australia. Back in the 19th century, members congregated in small branches, often, to start out with, in living rooms, to discuss not only the financial issues that confronted them, but issues of the day as well. And so emerged the common element of friendly societies that Alex notes in the book: self-reliance, mutual aid, entrepreneurship and community. These are the themes that we are looking to explore this evening. We're here tonight in the nation's parliament with parliamentarians from across the spectrum, yet these notions, self-reliance, mutual aid, entrepreneurship and community, when sat together, don't rest easily across our current political spectrum. How can we balance these values in the best interests of society? How can we encourage and embolden Australians to better look after themselves and their communities? Where can government reasonably get out of the way, and where must it be and where must it remain? There is much to be said for encouraging Australians to find their own best path, rather than infantilising them to the point of unnecessary dependency on the state, and yet fostering community and mutual aid for those in need is equally critical to a functioning democracy. These matters are well known, but I'm sure that we will find an interesting excursion and discussion over the next 90 or so minutes. But before we do that, we have a book to formally launch. And to launch, as I mentioned, unfortunately, in the absence of its author, I'm going to call upon George Megalogenis. Most of you will know George by reputation as a long-standing journalist and author, and more recently also a documentary maker. George has looked a great deal at recent Australian history through a lens that combines economics, politics and demographics. His most recent book, The Australian Moment, was fashioned earlier this year into a documentary for the ABC, in which he was able to secure access to all living Prime Ministers. His perspective on Australian life makes him an ideal choice, and Alex's choice, to launch the book tonight. George, welcome.
Thank you very much, and I'm not allowed to hold you up for long because we're still in the cocktail hour and we have to sit down in about 5 minutes sharp, and I'm going to rely on Sarah to give me the cut. Now, I'm honoured that Alex thought I could launch his book for him. It's a terrific little book. One of the reasons why, and I do encourage you all to read it, and after you've read it, do what Sarah's done, maybe read it a second time. It's not a corporate history. It also isn't an exhaustive history of Australia, but there's enough in there, both how the friendly societies developed and how Australia developed with it, alongside it, in spite of it, that hopefully will inform not just debates about present and future. There's something almost supernatural about this book coming out when it does. The period that he describes when the friendly societies took off in Australia is about the only period in Australian history you can find that looks something like the Australia we're living in today. Now, I'm just going to give you a couple of quick excerpts from the book just to describe the people who set these friendly societies up, and they'll resonate for you because Australian values, even though you could trace them all the way back to the First Fleet and Arthur Phillip's decision to ration food equally between all the convicts, that early egalitarian impulse essentially to hold that prison together. The first group that set these friendly societies up behaved, even though they all came from the same place, behaved differently in Australia than they did in the United States, a fellow settler society, and behaved differently than they did in Britain, especially where a lot of them came from. Now, my pet theory on this always is a migrant never goes to another country to repeat history but to change it. And there's always some chip of ancestral defiance in every migrant that wants to make a better life for themselves, almost in defiance of their parent. Which becomes, I'm not going to bore you with the detail, but when you get to the 1880s, there's a fair sense that the Australian-born, i.e. the generation that followed the group that set the friendly societies up, wanted to completely reimagine the way these societies operated because they didn't want to be anything like their migrant parents. But the reason why they actually landed and behaved differently in Australia, I think has a lot to do with the way Australia had already been set up. Now, whether it was in the soil, whether it was in the atmosphere, whether it was in the scarcity of labour, which meant that we were a high-wage society almost from the get-go. And I'll just read you a passage from Alex's book. Friendly societies in colonial Australia adapted to the uniquely egalitarian social conditions in the Antipodes, distinct from their originators in Britain or their counterpart organisations in the United States. For a start, and this will resonate, Australian membership was spread along the social continuum, not limited to any one class, as was the case in Britain, where traditionally structured class hierarchy still dominated. The Australian-friendly societies were also different from those in America, where working families received scant acknowledgement or respect. Now, this idea that a migrant would turn up in Australia and come to an egalitarian conclusion, and maybe a brother or a cousin had gone to America and decided to be elitist, is I think something to ponder. This is one of the reasons, this is one of the first details that jumped out at me from the book. The other part of this book that's interesting, though, is by the time you get to the 1880s, you get the Friendly Society, especially the Australian Natives Association, which is an antecedent organisation, in a position of extraordinary political influence where it basically gets the motor of federation going after the Depression of the 1890s. But in that organisation as well is the seat of another idea, a very, very damaging idea, which was the White Australia policy. They weren't the only ones, of course, but with Alfred Deakin as one of their members, you get two things happening at the same time in Australia. You get the idea of a federation, you get the idea of a high-wage society, you get the idea of government as an agent of social change, but also providing safety net. But you also get this idea that Australia cannot be shared with anybody else unless your skin is white. Now, the reason why I mention the two sides, and this is a very, very honest history, and full respect to Australian Unity for being able to look at both sides of Australia and the way both sides of Australia translated in their own organisation. This period in Australian history that we're in now, I'll just give you the headlines, we're all familiar with them. We're about to close on our 24th year of growth without the interruption of a deep recession. We've got the possibility of a land bubble, a property bubble in Sydney. We'll leave that to one side. Migration, the way it's been running for the last 10 years especially, is contributing more than half the population growth in Australia. In Melbourne, in Sydney and in Perth, the overseas-born population is at the same ratio that we last saw in the 1870s. So more than a third of each of those cities has somebody born overseas, and you add about another 30% for their children, 2/3 or higher, essentially first or second generation. You're actually looking at the demography we're living in today is very, very much like this particular period in history. If you take yourself back to the 19th century, Australia, essentially from the foundation of Melbourne to 1891, the graph does this. Because a couple of economists in the room, they'll be able to tell you that Australia basically had the highest standard of living from about 1852 and more or less held that position all the way to 1891. Our living standards quadrupled over that period from the foundation of Melbourne to the land bust. The next best, so our graph's up here, the next best is America, it only doubled. So no precedent at all for a society to create this much wealth quickly and to be able to spread it almost equally, or relatively equally. But they blew it with White Australia. And they blew it when the first shock came, which was the Great Depression of the 1890s. And that depression hit Australia harder than any other country in the world at the time. In fact, it wasn't a depression that was just an 1890s depression. It took till well into the first decade of the 20th century before incomes returned to the position of the previous peak. Now, I'm just going to leave that as the last thought before we raise our glasses to toast the book. Think about the position we're in now. Very, very rich. Most of the constituents, I'll address the politicians specifically, most of your constituents have not known a recession. The vibe you're getting from the electorate is, we've got to stop this, we've got to stop that. We don't want to let another person in. You've got to protect this. You've got to give me more money for that. I've got cost of living issues. I've got all these things to worry about. Have a good look at what happened to Australia the last time it was in this position and why it blew it. I trust that we won't blow it again, but this is why books like this are really, really valuable, because it does give you a really good idea that we've been here before and we don't want to repeat the mistake. Now, I encourage you all about the cut yet? I'm about to get the cut. Okay. Okay. I encourage you all to raise your glasses.
Shall we give everybody a moment to get a glass?
Yep, please do.
So that everybody can join in a toast. If you haven't had one,
And thanks for
the
bearing with
drinks
me
are
for
right
the
over
5
there.
minutes before
We'll
we
give you
jump
just
to
a
the
minute
top.
to grab a glass, and then we'll raise it in a toast. Just a moment.
Again, and for Alex, if he's watching the DVD, congratulations, mate. This is a very good book. Okay, we're ready. So the toast that I don't have a glass, but just imagine that I do.
Aww.
So we're raising a toast to Alex McDermott's book, to Australian unity on its 175th anniversary, happy birthday, and to the success of the forum.